Hi, this isn't exactly precise. It's a few days after actually the point that I'm talking about, but I want to reflect a bit on Joe Biden's first 100 days as American president. The 100 days is kind of seen as a barometer test of what direction a presidency goes in. I think I think we need to be careful, political scientists need to be careful not to weigh too much on that because you could have a situation where some major drastic event happens later in a presidency, and the leader in question may handle that very well or not very well. So, whilst the first 100 days is an important test, I don't think everything should weigh on it. I don't agree with that theory because I think things can develop later on. Nevertheless, the first 100 days are critical because, like I say, they set the hallmark of where presidency will lead. Now, I'm an outsider. Obviously, I'm not American, and it may be that if I was over there, I would have a different perspective. Nevertheless, the American presidency is an extremely high-profile position by its nature. So naturally, outsiders do have an interest. There will be a contingent of people who will never get Biden a chance because he's not Trump. So there will be hardcore Trump supporters, and even some uh, regular Trump supporters will just not give this man a chance because he's not Trump. And to be fair, there were some on the left who wouldn't give Trump a chance in the first few weeks of his presidency. Now, I still believe Donald Trump's one of the worst presidents of modern times. I think any successes he had are overshadowed by his disgraceful behavior and his contempt for democracy. Um, and I think, unfortunately, that is very far from gone, the legacy of it. He's planning to run again in 4 years. I think for Trump, it's personally just wants to get his own back on the current president. Um, and there is a risk that American politics will become a kind of US Game of Thrones or, an ongoing saga. And it may well be that the American people get tired of that and they want a change to the situation like completely. It may be that the American people don't want to see Trump versus Biden round two. Certainly his supporters would, but I'm not sure that the wider American populace would. This country has plenty of Trump supporters. You look at certain videos about Joe Biden, and it's like they're criticizing him just for the sake of criticizing him. Now, like I say, you did get that to some extent with the left as well, who would criticize Trump just for the sake of criticizing him. But I think this indicates just how deeply polarized America is right now. Um, I mean, my goodness, Mitt Romney was addressing a crowd yesterday, and he was being called a communist. Mitt Romney. Um, try imagining that in 2012. Why? Because he hasn't been slavishly devoted to St. Donald. I give any Republican credit for standing up against the Trump cult. Politically, it's not an easy thing to do. Why? Because they get polarized by their own party. They totally ruled out any chance of them running in 2024, and they're putting the country before the party. I do give Republicans credit who stand up against that mentality. I've never made a secret of the fact I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. But anyway, this isn't about Donald Trump. This is about Joe Biden. I just mentioned Trump because it's an big part of it, especially when he is planning to run again in 4 years. At least that's what he says, and if it can happen in that time. So, Joe Biden. I was always a little bit cautious about support for Biden because I felt that he is one of the most left-wing presidents the United States has had. Not socialist, as some would claim. I think the American idea of socialism is very different from the European idea of socialism. Biden's not a socialist. In fact, by European standards, he'd be pretty centrist. Um, by the standards of some European models, he'd even be slightly to the right. And that's saying something about the cultural differences in political outlook. but by American standards, Biden is definitely center left. Um, but he's not far left. He's not a Bernie Sanders. He's not an Alessandra Ocasio Cortez. Um, Alexandra Ocasio Cortez. He is, he's a center left figure, the same with Kamala Harris. Nevertheless, they have both pandered to the woke left. There's no question about that, and there's no escaping that. And it's something that does concern me because, as much as I'm critical of Trump, I'm also very critical of the woke left. And I do think that there's a risk here with Joe Biden that, when he made his State of the Union address recently, or his address to Congress, um, he hit all the right notes about unity and so on, but most presidents, bar Trump, say that. They touch on that sort of thing. In practice, it's harder because he also has to pander to strong elements in his own party. Joe Biden has a history of bipartisan work, actually, so there's no reason to suggest that by record he would be a polarizing figure. But I think it's more that realpolitik, the forces within his own party, could pull him that way. Um, but here's the problem: if Biden really means that he wants to be a unifying figure, if he wants to reach out to moderate Republicans, he needs to acknowledge how polarizing the woke left are in terms of how they um, how they categorize people. When they use terms like white privilege, when they really, really play up critical race theory and things like that, which the president has totally supported. And this is one thing I'm very wary of with the Biden administration. It's fully endorsed critical race theory in public schools. It's one of the few areas I agree with Trump on. He was right to question that because it does nothing but cause division. It doesn't help minority people. It it leads to this stigmatizing of all white people. It's toxic. I do think it's a very, very problematic thing. I mean, when you have, um, I don't know what the American term is, but young school children, I mean, I don't know what the grade levels are, I guess it's junior school, when they're being told that because they're white, they therefore should be ashamed or they should somehow know their privilege. And it's this sort of very dangerous way of dividing people. And the woke left have a lot to answer for in that regard. That also applies to the way that powerful networks like CNN handle race issues, which for the most part, in my opinion, is a disgrace. I think it's manipulative. I think it's distorted, and I think it's misleading. It doesn't show the whole picture. Um, but looking at actual policy areas, one challenge, of course, Biden has, and this is something that any president faces, is getting through Congress. And it's, unless I'm mistaken, it's pretty divided at the moment in terms of the numbers. So, something, a big hot button issue like guns, right? Biden's always been on the side of gun control, which is something I personally support. But I also recognize that for a left leaning Democrat president, get any reform on guns is going to be a very, very difficult thing. There were three mass shootings over the last month: Indianapolis, Atlanta, and Boulder, Colorado. So, that's unfortunately, that isn't out of the norm in the United States of America. I have long believed that the US has a very serious gun problem, and I've long believed that the way gun control has been debated, um, you get the NRA twisting it and scaremongering, telling people in red states that the Democrats are coming for your guns. There's actually very little evidence to support this, and there are advocates of gun control that don't want to take away all guns. They know that isn't possible. They support the Second Amendment, but they just recognize that something needs to be done about this problem. The ironic thing is, most gun owners, when polled, when asked some basic questions, they actually agree with the basic principles of gun control. They agree that guns shouldn't be in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. They agree that there should be some sort of regulation. So this is the paradox. You get the gun lobby scaremongering people, but when it actually comes down to the details, when it actually comes down to what is being proposed, it's you okay. There is a faction of the Democratic Party that want more radical action. They want like um, to take away guns, and that isn't practically possible. But I think Biden's a realist. I think he knows what is and isn't possible. But unlike Donald Trump, he knows something has to be done, and it simply cannot be a normal situation in America that this just is accepted. The US will always have guns. That's the reality. But political willpower can make changes, and it happened in the Clinton era, and it's happened at other times when there has been concrete action in place. There has been a reduction in mass shootings. Of course, that doesn't solve the issue of gangland killings in, frankly, Democrat-run cities, and this is something the Democrats need to be honest about. There is the issue of gun show loopholes and guns going into those cities, but the Democrats cannot hide the fact that crime levels are rampant in cities controlled by them. Cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Baltimore and Detroit. They can't get away from that. Most big cities in America are run by Democrats. So, they need to address that. And the president needs to be honest about the failings in his own party. If he's truly to be a unifying figure, he also needs to have the political courage to confront his own party. And so far, I'm not entirely sure if he's done that. Um, there'll be other hot button domestic issues like abortion and so on, but I think that's they are not that topical at the moment. Um, Obviously, the vaccine rollout's a major issue. The US is now approaching 600,000 coronavirus deaths. 600,000. Staggering figure. That's now approaching the estimated death toll of the American Civil War. And if it surpasses that, let's say it surpasses 700,000 deaths, which is very possible, it will actually be the single deadliest event in American history over a short period of time. You could argue the colonization and diseases brought by that killed more, but that was over centuries. This will be the deadliest event over a short period of time in American history, and that is profound. It really is. So that is his absolute number one priority, tackling the pandemic. I take the view that the more people are vaccinated, the more chance this is of being defeated. And that's where you get, conspiracy theorists warning against vaccines and so on. I don't think it's helpful. Foreign policy. I remember I was active in a few pro Hong Kong groups, and they were unfortunately very pro Trump and anti Biden to the point of being ridiculous in their partisanship. And the big speculation they had was that Biden would somehow be a puppet of China, that he would be a China stooge, that he would be a pushover. Well, so far that has not happened. I think they got that idea because on the campaign trail, Biden was less vocal about China. And, the Democrats also played up the, oh, Trump's being racist by talking about it thing, which I think was a mistake. But so far, actually, Biden has been quite hawkish on China. Um, his administration has continued the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed. His administration, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, has continued the policy of recognizing what's happening to the Uyghurs as genocide. Um, so far, all the indication is Biden is taking a tough line on China. That's very welcome because you do not want an American president who doesn't recognize what is going on here, that doesn't recognize that China poses an existential threat to Western liberal democracies. I would argue that what Biden is doing is reunifying Western alliances in a way that Trump polarized. So actually, Biden could go further on China than Trump did. But there will be people with blinkers up because they're so taken in by the Trump cult that, they'll continue putting out their silly little memes and saying Biden's a puppet of Beijing. I judge the man on actions, and so far, the signs are good. The signs are that Biden is taking China seriously, and so is his Secretary of State. Um, I know there's questions over his son's role, and that should be, taken seriously, but judge the president on his policies, and I think he is being practical and realistic when it comes to China. The same with Russia. He has taken a tough stance on the issue of Alexei Navalny and Putin's behavior. In fact, Biden called him a cold-blooded killer. You would never see Trump coming out with that. Trump was basically, he had this very strange way of being like totally reluctant to say anything against Putin. He'd have no problem insulting Western leaders, but when it came to Putin, oh, I don't know the guy. In my bad impression. But yeah, those who say that Trump's tough and Biden isn't, there's nothing tough about pandering to Putin in the way that he did. So, in that sense, I think Biden is defending Western liberal democracy. Of course, it's early days, anything can happen, but I see a president who is standing up to Beijing and Moscow, and I welcome that. I think it's a very good thing. I think it's very important. Um, Also, in foreign policy, Biden's talking about an end to the US presence in Afghanistan by September 11th, which of course is poignant 20 years after the events in New York and Washington and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Um, it's it's a big thing, but is it premature? Perhaps. The problem with Afghanistan is if if Biden takes a view that will only pull out when there's a guarantee the Taliban pose no threat, there's a guarantee that women's rights are respected, and so on, then the US would have to stay in Afghanistan for years still. So it's not an easy thing. But again, you had these people saying, "Oh, Biden's going to be a warmonger." Well, here he is ending a war. So a lot of the claims made against Biden just aren't weighing up to the reality. Um, Whether it's premature, time will tell. I think it might be. The Taliban still pose a serious threat, and they've been taunting this. They've been taunting Biden for making this announcement. Um, Maybe he was wrong to make it public, but the American people deserve some transparency on that. I think with that, it's hard to judge at this point. It may be that that is the right decision to make. It may be that pulling out as early as this September, I say early, but remember this is America's longest running war, 20 years now almost. Um, and the situation remains mixed in the sense that some progress has been made, and I don't think that should be overlooked. Schools have opened, women are in a better position than they were 20 years ago. However, the threats from the Taliban and increasingly ISIS remain very real. Um, but that's something that will need to be looked at closer to the time what the situation is in September. Um, Biden's recognition of the Armenian genocide, that's obviously polarized Turkey. Frankly, I think it's about time that Western leaders started standing up to Erdogan because I think he's sort of long been complacent that because Turkey's a NATO member, he can sort of blackmail the West and sort of take the idea that we'll be reluctant to stand up to him. By we, I'm talking about Western NATO partners because we need Turkey. The thing about the Armenian genocide, recognizing it, is it a foreign policy priority today? Probably not. It's probably not as important as issues today. Nevertheless, it's a symbolic move to say that, you know, um, we will answer back to Ankara. The Turks, of course, say that it's not fair that innocent Turks were also killed at that time, and they were. Um, but with Washington taking this position, it's probably going to put pressure on London as well to be more vocal in whatever our position is. Our position at the moment is not to recognize it as genocide, but to recognize it as a tragic period of history for the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Assyrians. But I do think probably will head that way. What consequences that will have in terms of relations with Turkey, I don't know. But I think that Erdogan is much like Imran Khan in Pakistan. He's an arrogant Islamist who thinks he can make demands of the West. And I do think there needs to be some blowback against that. Um, Climate change and issues around that. Biden again is bringing the United States back into the world community. he's going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And I welcome that. You know, people may have differences of opinion on climate change. They may say it's exaggerated. They may say that it's X, Y, and Z, but I'm not convinced that Trump's move of just pulling out completely was practical. I don't think that's the right way to go about things. Um, I personally feel that it's pretty hard to refute that increased human activity is going to have a detrimental effect on the environment. Now, in terms of the, is it causing stronger hurricanes and so on? That's something I haven't settled on, but I just think it seems a strange argument to say that when we have 8 billion people almost in this world, you know, an ever increasing population, ever increasing human activity, that somehow isn't going to have an effect at some point. That seems to me to be nonsensical. Um, so the fact that Biden's taken that seriously in a way that Trump didn't is a good sign. So I have to say, overall in foreign policy, I get quite a good impression from Biden. I'd give him probably 7 out of 10, not higher because a lot of his stuff still needs to be um, time time testing. But he's taken a strong line on human rights issues. For example, what's happening in Burma, what's happening in China. Um, so I'd have to say, so far, 7 out of 10. Domestic policy, I'd have to say 5 out of 10. Five because I support him on the gun issue, but I'm very wary of his pandering to the woke left and to issues like critical race theory. Biden says he wants to unify. If he really wants to do that, he needs to distance himself from that ideology because that is one of the most divisive things in America today. And it's going to polarize, for example, working class white Trump voters. If Biden really would want to reach out to those people, he needs to say, I understand you're struggling. I understand how you feel about these things. And you can't do that if you're simultaneously endorsing an ideology that says you're privileged. On issues like police reform, again, it's something that Biden cannot be silent about. It's one of the major domestic issues in America today. So he does have to take a position. And I personally think what the president should do is endorse significant police reforms, but also distance himself from notions about defunding the police or any such reckless positions like that. Um, I think Biden should take that sort of line. Um, but if he's promoting narratives like there is institutional racism, he needs to be very careful about that because that then is getting into areas like critical race theory. I think it's okay to say there is a problem in this country with racism, and there are areas that need to be looked at. Why are a disproportionate number of black men killed by police? But frankly, a courageous president would not be afraid of offending his own side. So Biden, in my opinion, also needs to be candid about black on black crime. Now, very few Democrat presidents do that. Bill Clinton did, to his credit, but it's not a vote winner among Democrats. And to me, a real test of leadership would be if Biden could turn around and say to the left of his party, look, we will tackle this issue of police brutality, but we also have to recognize a major cause of death among young black men in this country is gangland killings. And that is happening in cities controlled by our party. So Biden has to have the political courage to do that, and so far he hasn't. Um, so time will tell. So if I was to give a sort of ranking out of 10, um, certainly the whole Sleepy Joe narrative goes out the window. There's nothing sleepy about this president. Okay, sometimes he stumbles his words, but no more so than Trump did. Um, and bear in mind, this is a 78-year-old man. He's the oldest president ever. So I have to say, if I was to give an overall mark to Joe Biden so far, I'd say 5.5 to 6 out of 10. There's still areas he needs to prove to me that he's prepared to show political courage, standing up to the woke left, and distancing himself from divisive, polarizing critical race theory. He hasn't done that so far. However, on foreign policy, I do give Biden his due. I do think he's been quite strong. It's early days, but so far I give him credit. And of course, he'll be coming to this country in June with the G7 summit in Cornwall. So it'll be a good opportunity for him and Johnson to meet. There was speculation that there was tensions between Joe Biden and Boris Johnson over past remarks that Johnson had made. But I think Biden's the sort of man who moves on from differences. He showed that with Vice President Harris. You know, they'd had their differences. He nominated her as vice president. Victor as vice president. So I honestly think that's a little bit overblown. I think he'll have a good working relationship with Boris Johnson. And it's in the interest of both sides. So time will tell. But you know, if those Americans who are hoping that Biden will fail, why don't you put your country before party and just hope that Biden's successful for the sake of your country? If nothing else. You don't need to like the man, but at least surely it's in the interest of all Americans that he has a successful presidency. And that's just my own candid thoughts so far. Thanks for watching.